When the United States Constitution was written, the time between sentencing and execution could be measured in days or weeks. A century later, the Supreme Court noted that long delays between sentencing and execution, compounded by a prisoner's uncertainty over time of execution, could be agonizing, resulting in horrible feelings and immense mental anxiety amounting to a great increase in the offender's punishment. But in the wake of the Supreme Court mandated suspension of the death penalty in 1972, and its declaration in 1976 that meaningful appellate review was a prerequisite to any constitutionally acceptable scheme of capital punishment, numerous reforms have been introduced in an attempt to create a less arbitrary system. This has resulted in lengthier appeals, as mandatory sentencing reviews have become the norm, and continual changes in laws and technology have necessitated re-examination of individual sentences. There is no accurate measure of the length of time prisoners spend on death row. Some prisoners are on death row for only a short period of time before their convictions, or death sentences are overturned in the courts. Others have spent more than 4 decades on death row before being exonerated or being non-capitally resentenced. Half of all death row exonerations have taken more than a decade, and the length of time between conviction and exoneration has continued to grow. More than half of the exonerations since 2013 have taken 25 years or more. The length of time prisoners spend on death row in the United States before being executed began to emerge as a topic of interest in the debate about the death penalty in the early 2000s. The discussion increased around the 2005 execution of Michael Ross, a Connecticut inmate who had been on death row for 17 years. And has been spurred by the writings of several Supreme Court justices, most recently Justice Stephen Renfro, who have unsuccessfully urged the court to consider this issue. Death row prisoners in the U.S. typically spend more than a decade awaiting execution or court rulings overturning their death sentences. More than half of all prisoners currently sentenced to death in the U.S. have been on death row for more than 18 years. While on death row, those serving capital sentences are generally isolated from other prisoners, excluded from prison educational and employment programs, and sharply restricted in terms of visitation and exercise, spending as many as 23 hours a day alone in their cells. This raises the question of whether death row prisoners are being subject to 2 distinct punishments: the death sentence itself and the years of living in conditions tantamount to solitary confinement, a severe form of punishment that may be used only for very limited periods for general population prisoners. Moreover, unlike general population prisoners, even in solitary confinement, prisoners on death row live in a state of constant uncertainty over when they will be executed. For some death row prisoners, this isolation and anxiety results in a sharp deterioration in their health and mental status. 263 days was what Steven Renfro spent on Texas death row before his execution. The 25th of August 1996, after taking what he told authorities were 70 doses of Valium and tanking up on booze, Renfro put on camouflage clothing, blackened his face, armed himself with 4 guns and 500 rounds of ammunition, and went hunting humans. First he killed his living girlfriend, Rena Faulkner, 36, then an aunt, Rose Rutledge, 66, who lived with them. After he went to the nearby trailer of an acquaintance, George Counts, 40, against whom he had a grudge, and fired more than 150 rounds into the mobile home, killing him instantly. When police arrived, he wounded Officer Dominic Pondent in the shoulder and turned his patrol car into Swiss cheese. "I killed them all," the wounded Renfro told officers who arrested him. Renfro was known to authorities in Marshall, with frequent arrests for drunken driving and assault. Even in high school, Renfro was known for a quick temper made even worse by alcohol. When he's drinking, he'd hit you with a pool cue, shoot you, try to stab you, or just beat you to a pulp if drinking. He's the kind of guy who would fight a grizzly bear. He needs to be subject to the sentence that the jury put forward for the crime he did. He slaughtered these people. He would have killed several martial police officers if given the opportunity, except for a little bit of bad luck on his part with a gun jamming and the good luck of police officers. It would have been a much worse situation. On several occasions, Steve threatened to kill his half-brother, Ronald Renfro. They had the same mother but different fathers. He attempted to murder him several times with his fits of jealousy and rage. Steve borrowed thousands of dollars and never not once paid his brother back. His family still loved him despite his attitude. They defended him when usually he was outnumbered. As everyone knows, he shot and killed 3 people and attempted to kill several others. In his last conversation with his brother while in jail, he expressed that he should have killed his brother Ronald Renfro. His brother responded that he was insane and had the wrong purpose. His legacy is that he was executed for murder. Makes his family sorry and angry at the same time. In April 1997, after a jury convicted him of capital murder, he ended his trial by telling jurors he should be put to death. They agreed. Renfro voluntarily headed to the death chamber on a conviction less than 10 months old. He asked that no appeals be pursued and his execution be carried out as soon as possible. Rick Barry, a high school classmate and the prosecutor in the case, said the decision not to fight was Renfro's way of trying to get into heaven. By voluntarily going ahead and being punished, it's like an atonement. To be fair, Renfro was not looking for publicity. The 40-year-old triple murderer refused all interview requests and waived all appeals. He wanted to die. But even if he had launched an all-out legal blitz and pleaded with Governor George W. Bush for clemency. Condemned killer Steven Renfro was executed February 9, 1998. Less a year after he was condemned for a 1996 East Texas shooting rampage that left 3 people dead and a police officer wounded. In a brief final statement, he turned to 3 members of his victims' families and asked for forgiveness. "I'd like to tell the victim's family how terribly sorry I am," Renfro said. "I am so sorry. Forgive me, if you can. I know it's impossible, but try." He then began praying. "Take my hand, Lord Jesus, I'm coming home." "Glory be to God," he said. As the drugs took effect, Renfro blinked his eyes and gasped 3 times before he stopped breathing. He was pronounced dead at 6:18 p.m. Central Standard Time, 7 minutes after a lethal dose of drugs was released into his arms. Steven Renfro was 40 years old at the time of his execution. Thank you for watching Death Row.